The widow Victoria Owens stood alone at the edge of the harvest dance in Wallace, Idaho, watching couples whirl across the wooden floor while conversations died the moment anyone noticed her watching. It was October 1878, and she had been a widow for 3 years, ever since her husband Robert had been found dead in an alley behind the Silver Moon Saloon with a knife in his back and another woman's name on his lips. The whole town had decided that somehow, in some way they could never quite articulate, Victoria must have been responsible for driving him to whatever sin had gotten him killed. They whispered that a good wife would have kept her husband home, that a proper woman would have prevented his wandering, that perhaps she had even wielded the knife herself in a jealous rage, though the sheriff had cleared her of any wrongdoing. Still, the stain remained. She should not have come tonight. Victoria knew that the moment she stepped into the community hall, freshly built from pine that still smelled of sap and sawdust, but she was only 24 years old, and 3 years of isolation in her small cabin on the outskirts of town had worn her spirit thin as parchment. She had sewn a new dress for the occasion, a deep green cotton that brought out the auburn in her brown hair, and she had allowed herself to hope that perhaps time had softened the town's judgment. That hope had lasted approximately 5 minutes before she noticed how mothers pulled their daughters away from her, how the unmarried men suddenly found the punch bowl fascinating whenever she moved in their direction, how even old Mrs. Patterson, who had once been kind to her, turned her back and busied herself with adjusting her shawl. Victoria was preparing to leave, to slip out the back door and walk the 2 miles home in the dark, when the music stopped mid-song, and every head in the room turned toward the entrance. She followed their gazes and saw him standing in the doorway, a man so large he had to duck his head to enter, with shoulders that seemed to span half the width of the doorframe. His hair was dark brown and fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his beard was trimmed close to his jaw. He wore buckskin trousers and a worn flannel shirt that strained across a chest, built from years of hard mountain living. His arms were thick with muscle, and his hands looked like they could snap a tree branch without effort. Everything about him spoke of strength and wilderness, of a life lived far from the constraints of town society. Fletcher Evans had come down from his cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains, a full day's ride away, because his supplies were running low and winter was coming. He had not planned to attend any dance, had in fact groaned inwardly when he realized his arrival in Wallace coincided with their monthly social gathering. But his horse needed rest, and the livery stable owner had insisted that everyone in town would be at the dance, so if Fletcher wanted to arrange for his supply list to be filled, he had better show his face. Fletcher had lived alone in the mountains for 5 years, trapping and hunting and preferring the company of elk and pine trees to people. He was 31 years old and had left civilization behind after watching too many men destroy each other over gold claims and gambling debts. The mountains offered peace, solitude, and a kind of honest hardship that made sense to him. He stepped into the hall and immediately regretted it. The crowd pressed too close, the air was too warm, and the smell of perfume and pomade made his nose itch. His eyes swept the room, looking for the livery owner or perhaps the general store manager, someone he could conduct business with so he could leave. Instead, his gaze landed on a woman standing alone near the far wall, partially hidden in shadow. She was beautiful in a way that made his breath catch, with an oval face, dark eyes that held profound sadness, and a posture that spoke of dignity despite obvious discomfort. But what struck him most was her isolation. In a room full of people clustered in groups and pairs, she stood utterly alone, and the space around her seemed deliberately maintained by everyone else. Fletcher had spent enough years in the wilderness to recognize a wounded creature when he saw one. He had found injured animals before, deer with broken legs or wolves caught in traps, and they all had that same look in their eyes, wariness mixed with a desperate need for kindness. This woman had that look, and something in Fletcher's chest tightened in response. He had no idea who she was or why the town was treating her like a leper, but his feet were moving before his mind caught up with the decision. Victoria watched in disbelief as the mountain man walked straight across the room toward her. People parted for him like water around a boulder, their conversations faltering as they tracked his progress. She glanced behind her, certain he must be heading for someone else, but there was only the wall at her back. When he stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, she felt her heart hammer against her ribs. "Madam," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate in her bones. "Would you care to dance?" The room had gone completely silent. Victoria stared up at him, unable to form words. His eyes were hazel, she noticed, green and brown mixed together like a forest floor, and they held no judgment, no calculation, just a straightforward question, and something that might have been kindness. She started, her voice barely a whisper. "You should know that the town doesn't—" "I didn't ask the town," Fletcher interrupted gently. "I asked you." Victoria felt something crack inside her chest, some wall she had built to keep herself contained and safe. Her eyes burned with tears she refused to shed in public, and her hands were shaking as she placed one in his outstretched palm. "Yes," she managed. "Yes, I would." Fletcher led her onto the dance floor with a confidence that belied his discomfort with social situations. The truth was, he had no idea what he was doing. He had not danced in years, and even then he had been clumsy at best. But the look in this woman's eyes had stirred something protective in him, something that demanded he act, even if he made a fool of himself in the process. The musicians, after a moment of stunned hesitation, began to play again, a simple waltz that Fletcher vaguely remembered the steps to. He placed one hand on Victoria's waist, feeling how delicate she was beneath his palm, and held her other hand in his. She was trembling, he realized, and he wanted to ask why, wanted to know what the town had done to put that fear in her. Instead, he began to move, guiding her in slow circles around the floor. She followed his lead, her steps uncertain at first, then gradually growing more confident as the music swept them along. "I'm Fletcher Evans," he said quietly, speaking close to her ear so only she could hear. "I live up in the mountains." "Victoria Owens," she replied, her voice still shaky. "I live here in Wallace, or near it anyway." "Nice to meet you, Victoria." She let out a breath that might have been a laugh or a sob. "You may be the only person in this room who thinks so." Fletcher glanced around at the faces watching them, seeing the disapproval, the shock, the speculation in their eyes. "Then this room's full of fools," he said bluntly. "Begging your pardon for the language." This time it was definitely a laugh, small and surprised. "You have no idea what you're doing, do you? Dancing with me?" "I know exactly what I'm doing," Fletcher said, though that was a lie. "I'm dancing with a beautiful woman at a social gathering. Seems like that's what a man's supposed to do at these things." Victoria looked up at him, really looked at him, studying his face as if trying to determine whether he was sincere or simply cruel in a more subtle way than the town had been. What she saw must have satisfied her because some of the tension left her shoulders. "They think I killed my husband," she said quietly, "or drove him to his death at the very least. He was not a good man, and he died in a bad way, and somehow that became my fault." Fletcher processed this information, his expression unchanging. "Did you kill him?" "No, then they're wrong. It's not that simple." "Seems simple enough to me," Fletcher said. "You either did something or you didn't. If you didn't, then their opinions don't matter worth a damn. Begging your pardon again." Victoria felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been knotted tight for 3 years. "You're very straightforward." "Mountain living doesn't leave much room for dancing around the truth," Fletcher replied. "A bear doesn't care about your feelings, and winter doesn't postpone itself because you're not ready. Things either are or they aren't." They danced in silence for a moment, and Victoria became aware of how solid Fletcher felt, how steady. His hand on her waist was warm and strong, and she could feel the calluses on his palm where it held hers. He smelled of pine and leather and something else, something clean and wild that reminded her there was a world beyond this suffocating town. She had forgotten what it felt like to be touched without judgment, to be held without expectation. "Why did you ask me to dance?" she finally asked. "You could have asked anyone." Fletcher considered the question. "You looked like you needed someone too," he said honestly, "and I don't much care for the way this town was treating you. Seemed wrong." "So this is charity?" Victoria felt her defenses rising. "No," Fletcher said firmly. "Charity would be asking you out of pity. I asked you because I wanted to, because you're the only person in this room I had any interest in talking to." Victoria did not know what to say to that. She had grown so accustomed to being avoided, to being the subject of whispers and sidelong glances, that simple kindness felt foreign and slightly dangerous. She wanted to trust it, wanted to believe that this man meant what he said, but trust was a luxury she had not been able to afford in a long time. The song ended too quickly. Fletcher stepped back and released her, but he did not leave. Instead, he stood there looking down at her with those steady hazel eyes as if waiting for something. The musicians began another tune, and Fletcher offered his hand again. "One more?" he asked. Victoria knew she should say no. She should thank him politely and return to her corner, perhaps even leave entirely before she made things worse for herself. But she had not felt this close to alive in 3 years, and her hand was reaching for his before she could stop herself. "Yes," she said, "please." They danced 3 more songs, and with each one, Victoria felt herself relaxing into Fletcher's arms. He was not a graceful dancer, but he was steady and sure, and he held her like she was something valuable. Other couples had begun dancing again, though they kept their distance and their stares were still constant. Victoria tried to ignore them, tried to focus on the music and the warmth of Fletcher's hand and the way his chest moved with each breath. "Where in the mountains do you live?" she asked during the 4th dance, hungry for conversation, for connection, for anything that would help her remember how to interact with another human being without fear. "About a day's ride northeast of here," Fletcher replied, "up past the creek where the old logging camp used to be. I've got a cabin on about 20 acres of forest. Not much, but it's mine, and it's quiet." "That sounds peaceful." "It is. Lonely sometimes, but peaceful." Victoria understood lonely. She had been surrounded by people for 3 years and had never felt lonelier in her life. "What brought you down to town?" "Supplies. Winter's coming, and I need flour, salt, coffee, ammunition, things I can't make or hunt for myself. I try to make the trip twice a year, spring and fall, stock up enough that I don't have to come down more often than that." "You really don't like towns, do you?" Fletcher's mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile. "I don't like crowds, and I don't like the way people complicate things that should be simple. But I don't dislike civilization entirely. Just prefer to take it in small doses." "I used to love this town," Victoria said softly, "before Robert died. I grew up here, knew everyone, attended every social gathering. Then overnight, everything changed. The same people who smiled at me in church turned their backs on me in the street. The same women who invited me for tea started crossing to the other side of the road when they saw me coming." "What kind of man was your husband?" Victoria hesitated, unused to being asked direct questions about Robert. Most people assumed they knew the whole story and had no interest in her version of it. "He was charming when we met," she said carefully. "Handsome, well-spoken, the son of a prosperous rancher from Montana. He courted me properly, asked my father's permission, gave me a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. I thought I was the luckiest girl in the world. Then we got married, and I discovered that charm was just a mask he wore in public. In private, he was angry and restless, and always looking for something more, something better, something that would make him feel the way he thought he deserved to feel. He gambled away money we didn't have, drank himself into rages, and spent his nights at the saloon with women who weren't his wife. When someone finally killed him, probably over a card game or an insult or someone else's wife, the town decided I must have driven him to it, as if I had any control over what he did." Fletcher's jaw had tightened as she spoke, and his hand on her waist had become slightly more protective. "Sounds like the man got what he earned," he said bluntly. "And sounds like you're better off without him, though I'm sorry you've had to carry the weight of his choices." Victoria blinked back tears. No one had ever said that to her before. Everyone had implied or outright stated that she should be mourning Robert, that she should be consumed with grief and guilt. No one had acknowledged that his death might have been a relief, or that his life had been a burden on her. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea how much it means to hear someone say that." The song ended, and this time Fletcher did not immediately ask for another dance. Instead, he looked around the room, noting the hostile stares, the closed faces, the way the crowd had formed a kind of barrier around them. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "I saw a restaurant down the street that looked decent." Victoria's heart leaped at the idea of leaving with him, of extending this unexpected evening beyond the confines of the dance hall. But caution made her hesitate. "I don't want to impose on you. You've already been kinder than you needed to be." "You're not imposing. I'm asking." Fletcher waited, patient as stone, letting her make the decision. "Yes," Victoria said, making up her mind. "I would like that very much." Fletcher offered his arm, and Victoria took it, feeling the solid muscle beneath her palm. They walked toward the door together, and the crowd parted for them just as it had when Fletcher first entered. Victoria kept her chin up and her eyes forward, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her cower. Just before they reached the door, an older woman stepped into their path. It was Mrs. Patterson, the one who had turned away from Victoria earlier. "Victoria," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice sharp with disapproval, "I hope you know what you're doing." Fletcher answered before Victoria could. "Madam, with all due respect, I don't believe that's any of your concern." His voice was polite but firm, the tone of a man who would not be moved by social pressure. Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened and her mouth thinned into a line. "Well, I never." "Apparently not," Fletcher agreed pleasantly, and then he guided Victoria past the shocked woman and out into the cool October night. The air outside was crisp and clear, scented with wood smoke and fallen leaves. Victoria drew in a deep breath, feeling like she had been holding it for hours. The street was dark except for the warm glow of lanterns in windows and the silver light of a half-moon overhead. Wallace was a small town, nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains, with perhaps 200 permanent residents and another 100 who came and went with the mining seasons. Main Street boasted a general store, a blacksmith, a hotel, the saloon where Robert had died, a church, and the restaurant Fletcher had mentioned, along with a scattering of other businesses. Most of the buildings were less than 10 years old, built after the rush of miners and loggers had transformed the area from wilderness into settlement. "I apologize for Mrs. Patterson," Victoria said as they walked down the wooden sidewalk. "She used to be kind to me." "Don't apologize for other people's bad behavior," Fletcher said. "That's not your burden to carry." The restaurant was called Martha's Kitchen, run by a widow who had come west with her late husband during the gold rush and stayed after he died of cholera. Martha herself was working the counter when they entered, a stout woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes. Those eyes took in Fletcher and Victoria, and something shifted in her expression. "Evening," Martha said neutrally. "Table for two?" "Please," Fletcher replied. Martha led them to a corner table, somewhat removed from the handful of other diners scattered throughout the small space. She handed them handwritten menus and retreated without comment. Victoria realized she was holding her breath, waiting for the rejection or the coldness, but Martha had been neither welcoming nor hostile, just professional. It was more than Victoria had received from most of Wallace in 3 years. "What's good here?" Fletcher asked, studying the menu. "The roast beef is excellent," Victoria said, "and Martha makes the best apple pie in Idaho, though don't tell anyone I said so or I'll never hear the end of it from the church ladies who pride themselves on their baking." Fletcher ordered the roast beef for both of them, along with coffee and 2 slices of pie. Martha took the order with a nod and disappeared into the kitchen. The restaurant was warm and smelled of cooking meat and fresh bread, and Victoria felt herself beginning to relax in a way she had not allowed herself to in public for years. "Tell me about the mountains," she said, leaning forward slightly. "What's it like up there?" Fletcher considered, unused to describing his life to anyone. "It's beautiful," he said finally. "Especially in the fall, when the aspens turn gold and the air gets so clear you can see for miles. The cabin's small, just 1 room with a loft for sleeping, but it's tight and warm. I've got a good well, a barn for my horse and the mule, a shed for storing game and hides. I wake up when the sun rises and go to sleep when it sets. I hunt, trap, fish, chop wood, make repairs, tend the animals. In the winter, I mostly stay inside and work on tanning hides, carving, reading. I've got about 30 books that I read over and over. In the summer, I range farther, sometimes gone for weeks at a time following trap lines or tracking elk herds." "Don't you get lonely?" Victoria asked. "Sometimes," Fletcher admitted. "But I was lonely in civilization too. At least in the mountains, the loneliness is honest. It doesn't pretend to be something else." Victoria understood that in a way she could not have before Robert died. "I know what you mean. I'm surrounded by people here and I've never felt more alone. Why do you stay?" It was a simple question, but it struck at the heart of something Victoria had been avoiding for 3 years. "I don't know," she said slowly. This is my home. My parents are buried here. I own a cabin and a small piece of land. I keep thinking that if I just wait long enough, if I'm patient and proper and good, the town will forgive me for whatever sin they think I committed. But it's been 3 years, and nothing has changed. If anything, it's gotten worse. The story of what happened has calcified into accepted truth, and I'm the villain in it, whether I deserve to be or not. Martha arrived with their food, setting down plates of perfectly cooked roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh rolls. The portions were generous, and Victoria realized she was genuinely hungry for the first time in days. Martha poured their coffee and left without a word, though Victoria thought she saw something like sympathy in the older woman's eyes. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Fletcher had the appetite of a man who worked hard physically every day, but he did not eat quickly or messily. Victoria found herself watching him, cataloging details, the way his hands dwarfed the utensils, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his hair fell forward when he leaned over his plate, and how he pushed it back with an absent gesture. He was handsome in a rough, uncivilized way that should have frightened her, but somehow did not. "How long have you been alone in the mountains?" Victoria asked. 5 years. I came out here from Missouri in the spring of '73. Spent a year working in the mines near Virginia City, saved every penny I made, then bought the land and built the cabin. I've been there ever since. What brought you west? Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria thought he might not answer. Then he said, "The war brought a lot of men west. I wasn't old enough to fight in it, but I grew up in the aftermath, watching men try to piece their lives back together. My father was one of them. He came home from the fighting with half his leg missing and ghosts in his eyes. He drank to forget, and when the drinking didn't work, he got mean. I left home at 17 and started drifting. Worked cattle drives, railroad crews, anything that paid. Then I realized I didn't want to be around people at all anymore. I wanted space and silence and a life where what I did mattered in simple, direct ways. If I chop enough wood, I stay warm. If I hunt enough meat, I eat. If I fix the roof, I stay dry. No politics, no complicated emotions, no pretending to be something I'm not." Victoria heard the pain beneath his words, the wounds that had never quite healed. "Do you ever regret it? Living alone?" "Sometimes. Mostly in the winter when the snow's so deep I can't leave the cabin for days at a time, and the silence gets so heavy it feels like it might crush me. Or in the spring when the meadows are full of wildflowers and there's no one to share it with." He looked up at her, his eyes serious. "But then I come down to towns like this and see the way people treat each other, the way they judge and gossip and hurt each other, and I remember why I left." "We're not all bad," Victoria said softly. "I know," Fletcher replied. "I'm sitting across from proof of that right now." Victoria felt heat rise to her cheeks, and she looked down at her plate to hide her reaction. She could not remember the last time someone had paid her a genuine compliment, one that was not laced with ulterior motive or designed to manipulate. Fletcher seemed to say exactly what he meant, no more and no less, and the honesty of it was both refreshing and terrifying. They finished their meal and started on the pie, which was indeed as good as Victoria had promised. Fletcher ate his slice with evident appreciation, and Victoria found herself smiling at his obvious enjoyment. "What do you do with your time?" Fletcher asked. "When you're not being avoided by the whole town?" Victoria laughed, though it held an edge of bitterness. "I have a garden that I tend. I sew and mend clothes, which I sell to the general store for a little income. I read when I can afford books or can borrow them. I take long walks in the woods, though I have to be careful not to go too far alone. I attend church on Sundays, even though no one sits near me, and the pastor's sermons seem increasingly directed at my supposed sins. I suppose I'm just trying to survive, to get through each day and hope that somehow things will get better." "That's no way to live," Fletcher said bluntly. "I know, but I don't know what else to do." Fletcher finished his pie and pushed his plate away. He looked at Victoria for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. "Come up to the mountains with me," he said finally. Victoria's hand froze halfway to her coffee cup. "What?" "Come up to the mountains, see what it's like. Stay for a few days or a week, or as long as you want. If you like it, You could stay longer. If you don't, I'll bring you back to town. But at least you'll have seen that there's another way to live, another place to be." Victoria stared at him, her mind reeling. "I can't just leave. I have responsibilities, a home, a life here." "Do you? What responsibilities exactly? Who would miss you if you left tomorrow?" The words should have been cruel, but they were not. They were simply true, and the truth of them landed like a blow. Victoria could not think of a single person in Wallace who would notice if she disappeared. She had no close friends, no family left, no job that required her presence. She was a ghost in her own town, haunting the edges of a life that had ceased to exist 3 years ago. "I don't even know you," she said weakly. "That's fair," Fletcher acknowledged, "and I'm not suggesting anything improper. I'm offering you a place to stay, separate from my cabin if you want, and a chance to figure out what you want your life to look like. You'd be safe. I give you my word on that." "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Fletcher considered the question carefully. "Because I see what this town is doing to you, and it's wrong. Because I have been where you are, trapped in a life that was slowly killing my spirit, and I know what a difference it made when I finally got out. And because—" he paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Because in the 2 hours I've known you, you've made me feel less alone than I have in 5 years. That's worth something." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes again, and this time she let one fall, brushing it away quickly. She thought about her empty cabin, about the long, cold winter ahead, about another year of being invisible and despised. She thought about the way Fletcher's arms had felt when they danced, solid and safe. She thought about mountains and silence, and the possibility of peace. "I would need to pack," she heard herself say, "and close up my cabin properly." Fletcher's expression did not change, but something in his eyes warmed. "I need to finish arranging my supplies anyway. I was planning to leave day after tomorrow. Would that give you enough time?" "Yes," Victoria said, her heart pounding. "Yes, I think it would." They finished their coffee and Fletcher paid Martha, who took his money with a small nod that might have been approving. Outside, the street was even darker, and the dance hall had gone quiet. Most of Wallace had retired for the night. Fletcher walked Victoria home, and she was grateful for his presence beside her in the darkness. Her cabin was at the edge of town, down a rutted dirt road that led toward the forest. It was small, just 2 rooms with a porch, but it had been hers and Robert's, and after he died, she had scrubbed every surface trying to erase his presence from it. "Thank you for tonight," Victoria said when they reached her door, "for the dancing and the meal, and for treating me like a person instead of a pariah." "You don't have to thank me for basic human decency," Fletcher said, "but you're welcome just the same." He stood there in the moonlight, this mountain man with his long hair and rough clothing, and Victoria felt a pull toward him that was both frightening and exhilarating. She had known him for only a few hours, and yet he had shown her more kindness than anyone in 3 years. She was acutely aware that she was about to do something either very brave or very foolish, and she could not quite tell which. "I'll be ready day after tomorrow," she said. "In the morning?" "I'll come for you at first light," Fletcher promised. He tipped his head to her in a gesture that was old-fashioned and courtly, then turned and walked back toward town where he had left his horse at the livery. Victoria went inside and lit a lamp, looking around at the cabin that had been her prison for 3 years. Suddenly, it seemed unbearably small and dark, filled with ghosts and regrets. She thought about the mountains Fletcher had described, about gold aspens and clear air, and a life where things made sense in simple, direct ways. She thought about spending the winter alone here, in this cabin, in this town, slowly fading into complete invisibility. Then she began to pack. The next day passed in a blur of activity. Victoria sorted through her belongings, deciding what was essential and what could be left behind. She took her warmest clothes, her sewing supplies, the 3 books she owned, her mother's Bible, and the small amount of money she had saved from selling her sewing. She gave notice to Mrs. Henderson at the general store that she would not be providing any more mending for a while, citing a need to visit relatives in Montana. Mrs. Henderson had looked skeptical, but said nothing. Victoria paid her last month's rent to the man who owned the cabin, a sour-faced speculator from Spokane who cared only that his payment arrived on time. She packed away anything of value, boarded up the windows, and locked the door, uncertain whether she would ever return. That night, she lay in bed, unable to sleep, her mind spinning with second thoughts and fears. She was about to go into the wilderness with a man she barely knew, based on nothing more than a few dances and a shared meal. It was reckless and improper and probably dangerous. But the alternative was staying here, in this place where she was slowly dying of loneliness and judgment, and that seemed more dangerous still. At least in the mountains, if she was going to be alone, it would be by choice rather than exile. Fletcher spent the day finalizing his supply order, getting his horse reshod, and trying not to think too hard about what he had done. He was not an impulsive man by nature. 5 years of mountain living had taught him the value of careful planning and measured decisions. Yet he had invited a woman he had just met to come live in the wilderness with him, offering her shelter and protection with no clear sense of what he expected in return. The truth was, he did not expect anything. He simply could not bear to leave her in that town, to be slowly crushed by their collective disdain. He told himself it was just kindness, just one human being helping another, but he knew it was more than that. Something about Victoria had reached past all the walls he had built, all the distance he had maintained from human connection. Maybe it was the vulnerability in her eyes. Maybe it was the strength it took for her to keep her head high while the town shunned her. Maybe it was simply that she was beautiful and sad, and he was lonely and tired of pretending he was not. Whatever the reason, he wanted her safe, and he wanted her happy, and if he could provide even a small measure of either, it would be worth the disruption to his carefully ordered life. He slept that night in the livery's small guest room, and woke before dawn filled with an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. He collected his horse and the pack mule, both now laden with supplies, and rode out to Victoria's cabin just as the eastern sky was beginning to lighten. She was waiting on the porch, dressed in practical traveling clothes with her hair braided and tucked under a bonnet. She had 2 bags, one large canvas sack and a smaller carpet bag, and she looked both determined and terrified. Fletcher dismounted and took her bags, securing them on the mule with practiced efficiency. "You ready?" he asked. Victoria looked back at the cabin one last time, then at the town beyond, still mostly dark and sleeping. She thought about all the judgment and pain those buildings held for her, and then she looked at Fletcher, solid and steady in the gray dawn light. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." Fletcher helped her mount his horse, then swung up behind her. She stiffened at the closeness, at the way his arms came around her to hold the reins, at the solid warmth of his chest against her back. But as they started moving, heading northeast toward the mountains, she found herself relaxing into his strength. The horse moved smoothly beneath them, and the pack mule followed on a lead rope, and Wallace fell away behind them as the sun rose over the mountains ahead. They rode through country that grew progressively wilder and more beautiful. The valley gave way to foothills, and the foothills gave way to true mountains, their peaks already dusted with early snow. They followed a creek that ran silver and cold over smooth stones, and passed through stands of pine and aspen that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns. Fletcher pointed out landmarks: a lightning-struck tree, a meadow where elk gathered in the evenings, a rock formation that looked like a crouching bear. He spoke little, but Victoria found she did not mind the silence. It was not the hostile silence of town, but rather the comfortable quiet of 2 people who did not need constant conversation to feel at ease with each other. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch of bread, cheese, and dried meat. Victoria stretched her legs, stiff from the long ride, and drank cold water from the creek. The air this high was thin and clean, scented with pine and earth, and she could hear nothing but the water and the wind and the occasional call of a bird. No human voices, no wagon wheels, no church bells or hammering from the blacksmith. Just nature's own sounds, wild and free. "How much farther?" she asked Fletcher. "A few more hours. We'll get there before dark." He was checking the horse's hooves, making sure they had not picked up any stones. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine. A little sore, but fine." Fletcher glanced at her, taking in the color the mountain air had brought to her cheeks, the way her eyes seemed brighter than they had in town. "It suits you," he said, "being out here." Victoria smiled. "I haven't been this far from town in years. Robert didn't like me going anywhere without him, and after he died, I was too afraid of what people would say if I was seen wandering alone. I forgot how beautiful the world could be." They rode on through the afternoon, climbing higher into the mountains. The trees grew denser, the trail narrower, and the air progressively cooler. Victoria found herself pressing back against Fletcher's warmth, grateful for his presence. She could not imagine navigating this wilderness alone, could not fathom how he managed to live out here with nothing but his own resources to rely on. It spoke to a kind of strength and self-sufficiency she had never encountered before. Finally, as the sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, they emerged into a clearing. Victoria caught her breath. Fletcher's cabin sat in the middle of about 5 acres of open land, surrounded by forest on all sides. It was larger than she had expected, built of sturdy logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Beyond it stood a barn and a shed, both in good repair. A vegetable garden, now mostly harvested for the season, occupied one corner of the clearing. A creek ran along the eastern edge, the same one they had been following all day. The whole scene had a quality of peaceful isolation, of a place carved out of the wilderness through hard work and careful planning. "It's beautiful," Victoria breathed. Fletcher felt a swell of pride he had not expected. He had built everything here with his own hands, and he was proud of what he had accomplished, but hearing Victoria's genuine appreciation made it mean something more. "Welcome home," he said, then caught himself. Welcome to my home. Your home too, for as long as you want." He helped her down from the horse and began unpacking the supplies. Victoria looked around, taking in details. The cabin was well maintained, with no chinks in the logs and glass in all the windows. The porch had a rocking chair and a bench, both handmade. Firewood was stacked neatly against one wall, enough to last through multiple winters. Everything spoke of a man who took care of his possessions, who planned ahead, who respected the demands of the environment he lived in. Fletcher opened the cabin door and gestured for her to enter first. Inside, it was dim and cool, smelling of wood smoke and leather. The main room held a stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, a counter with a wash basin, shelves lined with supplies and books, and a rocking chair near the fireplace. A ladder led up to a loft where Victoria could see a bed. The space was sparse but clean, everything in its place, nothing wasted or excessive. "I'll sleep in the barn," Fletcher said, reading her thoughts. "You can have the cabin. I need to tend the animals anyway, and I've slept in worse places." "I can't take your home," Victoria protested. "You're not taking it. I'm offering it. There's a bed up in the loft, and I've got extra blankets in the chest there. Firewood's on the porch, and the well's just outside. I'll show you everything you need to know, and if you need anything at all, just call for me. I'll hear you." Victoria felt overwhelmed by his generosity, by the trust he was showing her. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for this." "Don't need repayment," Fletcher said. "Just need to know you're safe and not being ground down by that town anymore." He began bringing in her bags and his supplies, making multiple trips between the cabin and the animals. Victoria helped where she could, and together they unpacked everything and put it away. Fletcher showed her where the food was stored, how to work the stove, where the extra clothes and blankets were kept. He was thorough and patient, answering her questions without making her feel foolish for asking. By the time they finished, it was full dark outside, and Victoria was exhausted from the long day of travel. Fletcher built up the fire and put a pot of stew on to warm something he had made before leaving and brought with him. They ate together at the small table, and Victoria realized this was the most comfortable she had felt in years. There was no judgment here, no whispers or sidelong glances, just 2 people sharing a meal in peaceful silence. "I'll be close by if you need anything," Fletcher said when they finished eating. "Just step out on the porch and call for me." "Thank you, Fletcher, for everything." He nodded and gathered some blankets, then headed for the barn. Victoria was left alone in the cabin, in this strange new place that somehow felt more like home than anywhere she had been since her parents died. She climbed the ladder to the loft and found a comfortable bed with a thick mattress and warm quilts. She changed into her nightgown, said her prayers, and lay down, expecting to lie awake in the unfamiliar surroundings. Instead, she fell asleep almost immediately, lulled by the silence and the safety and the knowledge that for the first time in 3 years, she was exactly where she wanted to be. Victoria woke to golden sunlight streaming through the loft window and the smell of coffee and bacon. She descended the ladder to find Fletcher at the stove, cooking breakfast with efficient movements. He had apparently come in while she slept, though she had not heard him. "Morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Hope you don't mind. I figured you'd be hungry." "I don't mind at all." Victoria felt suddenly self-conscious in her nightgown and wrapper, though Fletcher seemed to deliberately keep his eyes averted, giving her privacy. She quickly returned to the loft to dress, then came back down to find the table set for two. They ate breakfast together, and Fletcher laid out the day's activities. "I need to check my trap lines and scout for deer sign. You're welcome to come with me if you want, or you can stay here and rest. There's books to read, and the garden still has some vegetables that need harvesting before the first hard freeze. Whatever you're comfortable with." "I'd like to come with you," Victoria said immediately, "if that's all right. I want to learn about how you live up here." Fletcher looked pleased. "Fair enough, but it'll be a lot of walking, and we might not be back until evening. You sure you're up for it?" "I'm sure." They set out after breakfast, Fletcher with his rifle and a pack, Victoria in her sturdiest boots and warmest shawl. He led her along trails that were invisible to her eyes but clear as highways to him, pointing out animal tracks, edible plants, signs of weather changes. He showed her how to move quietly through the forest, how to read the lay of the land, how to orient herself by the sun and the slope of the hills. He checked a series of traps set for beaver and marten, resetting those that had been tripped, collecting the furs from those that held game. He was unfailingly kind and patient, never making her feel like a burden, even when she stumbled or asked obvious questions. As they walked, they talked. Fletcher told her about his childhood in Missouri, about his difficult father and his gentle mother who had died when he was young. He told her about the years of drifting, the hard men and harder work, the gradual realization that he needed solitude more than society. Victoria told him about growing up in Wallace, about her parents who had loved her but died too young, about the loneliness of being an only child. She told him more about her marriage to Robert, about the slow erosion of hope, about learning to make herself small and quiet to avoid his anger. She had never spoken so openly about her past, but something about the forest and Fletcher's steady presence made it easy to be honest. "I always thought I was weak for not leaving him," Victoria admitted as they rested beside a stream in the afternoon, "for not standing up to him or running away." "You weren't weak," Fletcher said firmly. "You were surviving. There's a difference." "How do you know?" "Because you're here now. You left everything familiar and came into the wilderness with a stranger because you recognized that you needed more than what that town was giving you. That takes courage." Victoria had never thought of herself as courageous, but hearing Fletcher say it made her consider the possibility. "What about you?" she asked. "You left everything behind too." "I did, but I left for myself, to find peace. You left to escape pain. That's harder." They sat in companionable silence, listening to the water and watching a hawk circle overhead. Victoria felt something shifting in her chest, some tightness loosening. She looked at Fletcher, really looked at him, seeing past the rough exterior to the thoughtful, gentle man beneath. He was watching the forest with eyes that missed nothing, his body relaxed but alert, ready to respond to whatever came. She thought about the way he had walked across that dance floor to her, how he had ignored the town's judgment and simply treated her with respect. She thought about how safe she felt with him, how seen and valued. "Fletcher," she said softly. He turned to her, those hazel eyes patient and kind. "Thank you for seeing me. Not what the town said about me, but actually me." Fletcher reached out and very gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers barely grazing her cheek. It was the lightest of touches, but Victoria felt it like electricity through her whole body. "You're easy to see," he said quietly, "once you look past all the noise." They returned to the cabin at dusk, both tired but content. Fletcher showed Victoria how to help him skin and prepare the game he had collected, teaching her the proper way to handle a knife, how to preserve the furs for later tanning. It was messy, practical work, but Victoria found she did not mind. There was something satisfying about learning skills that had actual use, about understanding how to transform a wild animal into food and clothing. Over the next weeks, they fell into a routine. Fletcher would wake at dawn and tend the animals, while Victoria prepared breakfast. They would work together on whatever tasks the day required: chopping wood, hunting, gathering the last of the autumn harvest, making repairs to the barn, preparing supplies for winter. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Fletcher reading from one of his books or working on tanning hides, while Victoria sewed or mended. They talked for hours, sharing stories and opinions and dreams, learning each other's minds with the same care they brought to all their work. Fletcher taught Victoria how to shoot his rifle, how to track animals, how to predict weather by reading the sky and the wind. Victoria taught Fletcher how to sew a straight seam, how to make his simple meals more flavorful with herbs from the garden, how to laugh at small absurdities. She had not realized how much laughter had been missing from her life until Fletcher started teasing her gently about her initial clumsiness with the axe or her alarm at seeing a bear in the distance. His humor was dry and unexpected, and it delighted her every time she discovered a new facet of it. The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that transformed the forest into a wonderland. Victoria woke to find the world outside blanketed in white, and she stood on the porch in the cold dawn, marveling at the beauty. Fletcher came up beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. "Beautiful," he said, though he was looking at her rather than the snow. Victoria turned and found his eyes on her, warm and intent. Her breath caught. Over the past weeks, she had become acutely aware of Fletcher's presence, of the way her pulse jumped when he was near, of how she looked for excuses to stand close to him or brush against him in passing. She'd been telling herself it was just gratitude, just the natural result of his kindness. But standing here with him in the quiet beauty of the first snow, she could no longer pretend. She was falling in love with him, had perhaps been falling since the moment he asked her to dance. "Fletcher," she began, not sure what she wanted to say. He reached out and took her hand, his rough palm warm against her cold fingers. "Victoria, I need to tell you something." Her heart hammered. "What is it?" "I know I said you could stay here as long as you wanted, no expectations, and I meant that. But I need you to know." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Having you here has changed everything. This cabin isn't lonely anymore. The silence isn't empty. I wake up looking forward to the day because I'll spend it with you. I go to sleep grateful because you're safe under my roof. And I've realized that I don't want you here just as a guest or a friend. I want you here as my wife, if you'll have me." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "You want to marry me?" "I do. I know it's fast, and I know you might need more time, and I know you have reasons to be cautious, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, Victoria. I think I loved you from the moment I saw you standing alone at that dance, refusing to let them break you. And if you don't feel the same, that's all right. You can still stay here, and I'll never mention it again. But I had to tell you the truth." Victoria was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of joy and relief and overwhelming emotion. "I love you too," she said, her voice breaking. "I have for weeks, but I was afraid to say anything, afraid you were just being kind, afraid I was imagining things, afraid I'd ruin what we had by wanting more." Fletcher cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "You're not imagining anything. This is real. You're real. We're real." He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but she did not want to. She rose on her toes to meet him, and when their lips touched, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them learning the shape and taste of each other. Then it deepened, Victoria's arms coming around Fletcher's neck, his hands sliding to her waist to pull her closer. She had been kissed before, but never like this. Never with such tenderness mixed with passion, never with such a sense of rightness and inevitability. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes?" he asked, a smile in his voice. "Yes," Victoria laughed, still crying. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to everything." They stood there in the cold morning, holding each other while the snow fell around them, and Victoria thought that she had never been happier in her entire life. She had come to the mountains expecting only escape, but she had found love instead. Real love, built on respect and partnership and genuine affection. The kind of love she had dreamed of as a girl but thought she would never have. They were married 3 weeks later. Fletcher insisted on doing it properly, so they made the day-long ride back to Wallace to have the ceremony performed by the pastor at the church. Victoria was nervous about returning, about facing the town's judgment again, but Fletcher rode beside her with steady confidence, and she drew strength from his presence. The wedding was small and brief. Only Martha from the restaurant attended, along with the livery stable owner and his wife, who had always been kind to Fletcher. The pastor performed the ceremony with visible reluctance, clearly disapproving but unable to refuse without cause. Victoria wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, and Fletcher wore his cleanest clothes, his long hair tied back, his beard trimmed. When the pastor asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence was pointed but not broken, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Fletcher kissed Victoria with such obvious love that even the disapproving witnesses could not help but soften slightly. They spent their wedding night at the hotel in Wallace, Fletcher having insisted on giving Victoria at least one night of comfort before they returned to the mountains. In the privacy of their room, with the lamp turned low and the world shut out, Fletcher was gentle and patient, mindful of Victoria's past experiences with marriage. He took his time, learning what she liked, making sure she felt safe and cherished. Victoria had never known that physical intimacy could be like this, tender and passionate in equal measure, two people giving and receiving pleasure with mutual care. She fell asleep in Fletcher's arms, feeling transformed, claimed in the best possible way, utterly and completely his. They returned to the mountain cabin the next day as husband and wife, and Victoria felt the truth of that bond settle into her bones. This was her home now, truly and officially. Fletcher was her husband, her partner, her love. Everything that had happened in Wallace, all the pain and judgment and loneliness, felt like it belonged to a different person, a different life. The winter came in earnest, and they settled into the rhythm of mountain life. Snow piled deep around the cabin, sometimes trapping them inside for days at a time, but Victoria did not mind. She had Fletcher, and she had purpose, and she had love. They spent the long, dark evenings by the fire, talking or reading or simply sitting in comfortable silence. They made love in the warmth of the loft while the wind howled outside. They cooked together, worked together, laughed together. Fletcher taught Victoria how to tan hides and carve wood, and Victoria taught Fletcher how to knit and how to appreciate the small domestic pleasures he had been denying himself for years. In late February, Victoria began to suspect she was pregnant. She told Fletcher one evening as they sat by the fire, and he swept her into his arms with a whoop of joy that made her laugh. He became even more protective after that, insisting she rest more, take on less physical work, eat the best portions of their food. Victoria protested that she was not fragile, but she secretly loved his attention, his constant concern for her well-being. Their son was born in early October, almost exactly a year after that first dance in Wallace. Fletcher delivered the baby himself, having learned the basics from his mother, who had been a midwife. It was difficult and frightening and beautiful, and when Fletcher placed the squalling infant in Victoria's arms, both of them were crying. They named him Thomas after Fletcher's brother who had died young, and from the moment he drew his first breath, both parents were completely besotted. Thomas was a healthy, happy baby with his mother's dark eyes and his father's strong build. He grew quickly on Victoria's milk and the clean mountain air, and by his first birthday he was walking and starting to talk. Fletcher built him toys from carved wood, and Victoria sewed him clothes from the softest fabrics she could trade for in town. They took him with them everywhere, Thomas riding in a pack on Fletcher's back, learning the forest from infancy. When Thomas was 2, Victoria gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, after Victoria's mother. Sarah had Victoria's auburn hair and Fletcher's hazel eyes, and she was fierce and determined from the start. The cabin rang with children's laughter now, with crying and playing and all the chaos of family life. Fletcher built an addition to the cabin, creating a separate room for the children, and Victoria planted a larger garden to feed their growing family. They made the trip to Wallace twice a year now, in spring and fall, to trade furs and meat for supplies and news. Victoria noticed that the town's attitude toward her had shifted. She was no longer the scandalous widow, but rather the mountain man's wife, the woman who had left civilization behind for love. Some still judged her, but many more had come to respect her choice, even envy it. Mrs. Patterson, the woman who had confronted them at the dance years ago, actually apologized during one visit, admitting that Victoria had found happiness while most of the town remained trapped in their small, constrained lives. Victoria accepted the apology graciously, but felt no particular triumph. Wallace and its opinions mattered less to her with each passing year. Her life was in the mountains now, with Fletcher and their children, and she had never been happier. She had a partner who loved and respected her, who worked beside her and listened to her opinions. She had children who were healthy and free, growing up strong in the wilderness. She had purpose and meaning and joy. On a warm evening in late summer, when Thomas was 5 and Sarah was 3, Victoria stood on the cabin porch watching Fletcher play with the children in the meadow. He was chasing them in circles, roaring like a bear while they shrieked with delighted laughter. The setting sun turned everything golden, and Victoria felt such overwhelming love for her family that it almost hurt. Fletcher looked up and caught her watching. He said something to the children, then jogged over to the porch, breathing hard but smiling. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, sliding an arm around her waist. "I'm thinking about how different my life could have been," Victoria said. "If you hadn't walked across that dance floor, if you hadn't seen me when everyone else looked away, if you hadn't asked me to dance." Fletcher pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I think about that too sometimes, how close I came to just collecting my supplies and leaving town without ever going to that dance, how everything might have been different." "I would have stayed in Wallace," Victoria said quietly. "I would have stayed and I would have slowly disappeared, and I never would have known what it felt like to be truly loved." "But I did go to the dance," Fletcher reminded her, "and I did ask you. And you said yes? And here we are?" "Here we are," Victoria echoed, smiling. She turned in his arms to face him properly. "I love you, Fletcher Evans. Thank you for saving me." "I didn't save you," Fletcher said seriously. "You saved yourself. You had the courage to leave, to try something new, to risk everything for a chance at something better. I just offered you a place to land. Then thank you for that, for giving me a home, for loving me when no one else would." "Loving you has been the easiest thing I've ever done," Fletcher said, and kissed her while their children played in the meadow and the sun set over the mountains they called home. 2 more children followed in the years after that, another son they named Fletcher Jr., who everyone called Junior, and a youngest daughter named Emma. The cabin grew to accommodate them all, and the clearing rang constantly with noise and life. Fletcher taught all the children to ride, hunt, track, and survive in the wilderness. Victoria taught them to read, write, cook, sew, and tend the garden. The children grew up strong and capable, comfortable in the mountains, unafraid of hard work or solitude. As the years passed, Victoria and Fletcher aged together, their love deepening rather than fading. They had their disagreements, their difficult moments, the challenges that come with any long marriage. But they always worked through them, always came back to the foundation of respect and partnership they had built from the beginning. Fletcher never raised his voice to Victoria, never made her feel small or afraid. Victoria never manipulated or deceived Fletcher, never withheld affection as a weapon. They had both seen what bad marriages looked like, and they were determined to build something better. When Thomas turned 18, he left the mountains to attend college in Spokane, wanting to study engineering. Fletcher and Victoria were sad to see him go, but proud of his ambition. Sarah married a trapper she met in Wallace when she was 20, a good man named David who respected the mountains and understood the life Sarah had grown up in. They built their own cabin about 5 miles from Fletcher and Victoria's, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to have their own space. Junior took over more and more of Fletcher's work as Fletcher aged, eventually building his own cabin on the far side of the clearing. Only Emma stayed in the main cabin, caring for her parents as they grew older. Fletcher died at the age of 76 after a full and rich life. He went peacefully in his sleep, Victoria beside him, his hand in hers. Victoria mourned him deeply, but also celebrated the life they had built together, the 45 years of love and partnership and joy. She lived another 5 years after Fletcher's death, surrounded by children and grandchildren, still sharp-minded and capable until the very end. She died on a cool spring morning with Emma holding her hand, and her last words were, "Tell your father I'm coming. Tell him to save me a dance." They buried Victoria beside Fletcher in a meadow on the mountain, under a pair of aspens that turned gold every fall. Their children carved wooden markers for both graves, simple but enduring. The epitaph on Victoria's marker read, "Beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She chose love over fear and found everything she ever needed. On Fletcher's it said, "Beloved husband, father, and grandfather, he saw her when no one else would." The story of Victoria and Fletcher became a kind of legend in Wallace and the surrounding areas, told and retold over the generations. It was the story of the widow the whole town avoided and the mountain man who walked right up and asked her to dance. It was the story of two people who found each other against all odds, who built a life together in the wilderness, who proved that love and courage could overcome judgment and fear. And it was a story that ended not with sadness or regret, but with a family that carried their legacy forward, with grandchildren and great-grandchildren who knew that their ancestors had loved each other truly and completely until their very last breaths. In time, the cabin fell into disrepair as the family spread out and moved on. But the meadow where Victoria and Fletcher were buried remained a sacred place for their descendants, visited every spring and fall by those who remembered what had happened there. They would stand among the wildflowers and the aspen trees and remember the love story that had started with a single dance, a moment of kindness in the face of cruelty, a choice to see someone truly rather than accepting what others said about them. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind was just right, people swore they could hear laughter in the meadow, the sound of children playing, and a man's deep voice, and a woman's bright response. Whether it was memory or ghost or simply the mountain itself remembering its own history, no one could say. But it was a comforting sound, a reminder that love, once established, never truly dies. It echoes through the generations, shaping the lives of people yet unborn, proving that one moment of courage, one act of kindness, one decision to walk across a room and ask someone to dance can change everything. Victoria and Fletcher's story taught their descendants to look for the truth beneath the surface, to question popular judgment, to have the courage to forge their own paths. It taught them that home is not a place, but rather the people you choose to build a life with. It taught them that strength comes in many forms, that gentleness and power can coexist in the same person, that love is both a feeling and a choice, renewed daily through action and commitment. The mountain cabin where they had lived, though fallen now, remained a pilgrimage site for the family. On important occasions, weddings and births and memorials, someone would make the journey up the mountain to stand where Victoria and Fletcher had stood, to remember where it all began. They would tell the story again to the newest generation, keeping it alive, making sure the children understood what their great-great-grandparents had accomplished simply by loving each other in the face of a world that said they should not. And the story always ended the same way, with a reminder that would echo through all the years that followed. Your great-great-grandfather Fletcher walked across that dance floor when no one else would. He saw your great-great-grandmother Victoria when the whole town turned away. He asked her to dance, and she said yes, and from that one moment of courage came everything. Our entire family, all of us standing here today, we exist because one man decided to be kind and one woman decided to be brave. Remember that, honor that, and when you see someone standing alone, someone the world has judged unfairly, have the courage to walk across the room and offer them your hand. You never know what might grow from a single act of kindness. And so the story of Victoria and Fletcher lived on, generation after generation, a testament to the enduring power of love, the importance of seeing people truly, and the life-changing potential of one perfect dance on an October evening in Wallace, Idaho, in the year 1878. Their love story became the foundation upon which an entire family was built, proof that the best romances are not those that begin easily, but those that triumph over adversity through courage, commitment, and an unwavering belief that everyone deserves to be seen, valued, and loved. The mountains remembered them, the meadow held their bones, the aspens turned gold every fall like a celebration of their love. And somewhere, in the wind that moved through the trees, in the water that ran cold and clear through the creek, in the very stones and soil of the place they had called home, Victoria and Fletcher's love remained, as permanent and enduring as the mountains themselves, a reminder that true love never dies but becomes part of the landscape, shaping everything that comes after, forever and always.